Boa tarde a todos, bem-vindos ao nosso webinar dedicado à sustentabilidade e, concretamente, à redução do uso de plástico único no alojamento turístico. Já temos connosco a nossa oradora, Jo Hendricks, da Travel Without Plastic, a nossa parceira na organização deste webinar e das ferramentas de capacitação para os nossos agentes turísticos. Estamos aqui a admitir ainda alguns participantes, mas para vos dar as boas-vindas e para vos explicar o enquadramento desta iniciativa e do projeto onde esta iniciativa se integra, dou a palavra a Leonor Picão, do Turismo de Portugal, que vos transmitirá essa mensagem. Leonor.
Olá, boa tarde a todos, espero que me estejam a ouvir bem. É com o maior prazer que estamos aqui reunidos novamente para falar de um tema dentro do amplo conceito da sustentabilidade, um tema perfeitamente alinhado com a Estratégia Nacional de Turismo 2027 e, neste caso em particular, com os objetivos do Fundo Ambiental em termos de economia circular e de sustentabilidade ambiental. Dada a situação difícil que o setor atravessa, este foi o momento que o Turismo de Portugal considerou pertinente para relançar aqui o tema da sustentabilidade e lançar o projeto Turismo Sustentável, um plano que se denomina Turismo Mais Sustentável 2023, e que abrange mais de 70 iniciativas que procuram tornar Portugal um destino de excelência cada vez mais sustentável, sendo que no âmbito deste plano mais alargado foi feito um protocolo entre o Fundo Ambiental, o Turismo de Portugal e alguns parceiros para o desenvolvimento do projeto Turismo Sustentável, um melhor futuro para e com todos. É no âmbito deste projeto Turismo Sustentável que são desenvolvidas 6 ações que pretendem precisamente concretizar este espírito de sermos cada vez mais amigos do planeta e cada vez melhores para as gerações futuras em termos de desempenho da atividade turística. E então temos vários temas, como reeducar para uma restauração circular e sustentável, a economia circular no alojamento turístico, a neutralidade carbónica nos empreendimentos turísticos, a construção sustentável também em empreendimentos turísticos, a eficiência hídrica nos campos de golfe em Portugal e, por fim, porque é hoje esse o tema que nos traz aqui a este webinar, a redução do plástico no alojamento e nos operadores turísticos. Portanto, um trabalho para um turismo sem plástico, aqui com um parceiro muito relevante de Travel Without Plastic, a quem agradeço esta cooperação e portanto, é hoje este o tema que nos fará aqui debruçar e refletir sobre este modo de estar que terá que ser cada vez mais uma realidade no futuro e para a qual estamos todos a trabalhar, mas é um trabalho que depende de todos e, portanto, que pretende aqui abranger e chegar ao maior número de pessoas para que esta, que é uma preocupação nossa, seja também uma preocupação do setor. Só assim, efetivamente, conseguiremos um desempenho cada vez mais sustentável e o reconhecimento do nosso país como um país sustentável que também procura, assim, fazer com que o turismo seja uma força para o bem em termos do planeta e da vida de quem habita, que somos todos nós. Muito obrigada, um bom trabalho, uma boa sessão, espero que corra bem e que o que aqui hoje vamos ouvir sirva de inspiração para as nossas atividades. Obrigada, Teresa, e um bom trabalho a todos.
Muito obrigada, Leonor, pelas palavras e pelo enquadramento desta iniciativa, onde temos vindo a abordar ao longo 2 semanas já tantos temas relacionados com a sustentabilidade. Vamos então dar início. Eu pedi a todos os participantes que desligassem o som e as suas câmaras para ficarmos só a ver a oradora e a sua apresentação. Dou as boas-vindas à Jo Hendricks, que é fundadora da associação Travel Without Plastic, que tem vindo a trabalhar este tema já há algum tempo, é reconhecida internacionalmente, trabalha com vários países e é com a Travel Without Plastic que o Turismo de Portugal está a desenvolver um conjunto de ferramentas de apoio às empresas para a redução do plástico de uso único. Contamos também, e isso é muito importante para nós, com a parceria e a colaboração do Pacto Português para os Plásticos, enfim, uma entidade à qual o Turismo de Portugal também pertence e que, enfim, do ponto de vista técnico também tem acompanhado os trabalhos e tem dado uma ajuda preciosa. So, Jo, thank you very much for being with us, for working with us in this project, which we think it's so important and so useful for our companies, our businesses. Sustainability is in the agenda everywhere and in Portugal too. And so thank you very much for working with us in these tools to aware and to help all our companies to do the right things regarding the best for our planet and for our tourism and our tourists. So, Jo, I give you the word. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Teresa, and good afternoon to everybody. I wanted to keep my camera on to say hello, and then I'm going to share my screen so that we can go through the presentation. So bear with me for a second as I do that.
Aproveito para referir que, enfim, como sabem, a apresentação será em inglês, ainda que todos os materiais que estamos a desenvolver com a Travel Without Plastic, obviamente que serão em português e ficarão disponíveis até ao final do mês. A Jo irá explicar isso tudo. Jo.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, I do apologise in advance for the presentation being in English, but I think Teresa said there all of the supporting documents are, of course, going to be in Portuguese. I will be presenting today. My colleague at Travel Without Plastic, Rachel McCaffrey, will be leading a presentation tomorrow. This is our agenda for today. I'll do a very quick introduction to Travel Without Plastic for those of you that don't know us, and just remind ourselves why reducing plastic is so important. And then we'll look at the 6 strategic steps to reducing plastic in accommodations. Now, in this presentation, we keep the advice quite high level, as the details of all the possible changes you can make in your accommodations are included in the Let's Reduce Single-Use Guide and the Sustainable Communications Guides that will all be made available as part of this project. So Travel Without Plastic was founded in 2017, but this is based on many years of previously working in sustainable tourism and helping hotels and tour operators to reduce waste. Personally, I've worked on plastic reduction in hotels since 2011, but it was really in 2017 when this became a main focus, and we started to work with hotel chains and tour operators around the world. And we created a range of guidance documents and toolkits, and we've undertaken workshops and webinars for hundreds of hospitality staff. We're really delighted to be working together with Turismo de Portugal on this project to adapt and translate a number of our tools so that they are relevant to the Portuguese contact and they can be freely available to accommodation and tourism businesses. So this webinar today is designed to support those of you that are getting started or that want to accelerate change. Now, we always start any of our presentations with why we do the work that we do, and essentially it's quite simple, and that's because the world wasn't designed to digest plastic. So plastic doesn't decompose in the same way as organic products. If plastic is disposed of irresponsibly or finds its way into natural environments, it will do one of two things, and that will be remain intact for many years, sometimes centuries, or it will break up into tiny pieces better known as microplastics, and these have already made it to every corner of the earth and even into our food chain. And whilst one bottle might not seem a big deal, these are actually the statistics from just one hotel that we work with, not in Portugal, I might add, but one hotel that we work with, which when you look at those statistics on the screen, and this is just a small percentage of the types of single-use plastic. If it's possible to just mute the microphones, that would be great. Thank you. So when I typed in Portugal into booking.com last week, 13,460 accommodation options were presented to me. Now, not all of them would be getting through this many plastic items, but just thinking about these statistics like this and multiplying them by the number of accommodation providers, not just in Portugal, but around the world, it helps us to realise the scale of the problem. And sadly, because plastic is such a lightweight material, even if it's disposed of correctly, it can easily blow away and become litter or pollution. And the results of that are obviously very widely known. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, around 600 wildlife species now are impacted by ocean plastic, and scientists estimate that the Atlantic Ocean itself holds anywhere between 12 to 21 million tons of plastic waste. Every year, around 1 million seabirds and 100,000 marine mammals are killed by ocean plastic. But it's not just bad news for wildlife, it can be quite bad news for us too. The microplastic particles that I just mentioned earlier, for instance, they can make their way into our food chain through fish, through seafood, through bottled water, and even via the air that we breathe. And a study done in Australia estimated that humans could actually be ingesting the equivalent of a credit card in microplastic every single week, which seems amazing. The consequences, obviously, to our health are not very well documented at the moment, but I think we can all probably agree that we would prefer not to be ingesting microplastic. And tourism obviously also does contribute to marine pollution. Now, as much of the Portuguese coastline is Atlantic facing, the problem of plastic pollution may not be so visible on some beaches or marine excursions. But the Mediterranean serves as a good example to demonstrate how tourism contributes significantly to plastic pollution. And research undertaken a couple of years ago by the WWF showed that pollution increases 40% in the Mediterranean Sea during the summer as a result of international and domestic tourism. And it can be quite easy for us to think as businesses that our actions alone can't really make a difference. But when you think about the thousands of tourism businesses all over the world, all using single-use plastic, then even the smallest actions can make a difference. Last week, while I was preparing for this webinar, I went on to TripAdvisor and I put Portugal in as a destination, and then I searched for the word plastic to see what came up in the results. And I think it's really interesting to see that words like cut down on plastic are actually the choice for the title of some people's review. And I don't think that's something that we would have seen 5 years ago. And it shows that customer sentiment is really changing. But I also found these really positive reviews, which was actually really lovely to see. And it shows that it is worth putting the effort in now to future-proof your business. And despite the extremely challenging situation that we all find ourselves in right now, it really is a good time to rethink business strategies and operations so that tourism starts to come back to life. We see less of the negative impacts and poor reviews and more of the positive comments that will encourage people to travel to your hotel or your destination. And before I go into the 6-step strategy, I wanted to share some insight into what we've found out over the course of the last 4 years working with hotels around the world to reduce plastic. Those that are successful with their plastic reduction programs have a range of things in common. And the first is that they are absolutely clear about their own vision, their goals and their strategies, and they're completely committed to them. It's almost become part of their DNA. If you're not clear about what you're trying to achieve, then it's very difficult to engage staff and guests and to get their support. So your goal doesn't necessarily have to be to go completely plastic free. It could be plastic-free guest rooms or just even free from single-use water bottles. Choose a strategy that is right for you at this moment, and you can always build on that as you move through. The hotels that are successful have made official changes to operational procedures and to brand standards so that they're not impacted by a high turnover of staff, and they actively seek help and advice, or they share their own experiences with others. They're genuinely interested in making a positive impact, and they regularly update social media accounts with information on plastic reduction. Their websites reflect their strategies, and it's very easy to find updates about their progress through transparent reports. So it's worth just bearing these 4 key success strategies in mind as we move through the rest of the presentation. But all of those successful hotels started somewhere. Everybody has to start somewhere. So no matter where you are in your plastic reduction journey, you can follow these steps over and over again to start or to accelerate your progress. The reason there are only 5 boxes and 6 steps is because measuring is the first step. You need to know your baseline, but it's also important at the end again to measure to see whether the changes you have made are working. So let's go in at number 1. The first thing that you need to know so that you can tell if you're making a difference or not is to know where you're starting from. Obviously 2020 is not a good baseline year, so maybe take 2019 statistics of plastic consumption and normalize those with guest nights so that you can at least get some kind of comparison if you are going to be operational this year. And when you go into the baseline, it's a good time to look at why certain products are used. So are you using certain plastics because of brand standards, or maybe because of requirements for star ratings? Or could it be out of habit, something that your business has done for so long that you don't even think about it anymore? And by knowing this, it will help you to understand what you might be able to change. And once you know the types of products, the quantity being consumed and the cost to your business, you can consider a number of options to start your journey or to accelerate your progress. And there's no right answer out of these strategies on the screen. It's whatever works best for your business right now. So we'll look at these in a little bit more detail. So some products we find about 15% of them from hotels that we've worked with are ordered out of habit. So you can imagine you get low on stock and they are simply reordered without anybody actually questioning whether those products are needed or if they truly add value to the guest experience. If you have conversations about reducing or eliminating single-use plastic, and you find yourself saying, "Oof, but guests would complain if we remove them," then you've definitely got a plastic habit. Now, customer attitudes to single-use plastic are changing very quickly, and rather than assume that people would complain without asking them, take the time to ask them, and you might be surprised. In Mallorca, a couple of years ago, in 2019, one hotel manager told us that guests would complain if he took away the slippers. And I asked him how he knew that. How did he know the guests would complain? And he just told me that he knew his guests really well and they would definitely complain. Part of the project in Mallorca was to speak with the guests and ask them how they would feel if certain products were eliminated as part of a plastic reduction strategy, and over 80% of those guests would be happy to see single-use slippers removed. And it's really important that we don't assume and that we stop saying that people would complain, because that would suggest that maybe we haven't tried to see if they actually complain, and we could take a proactive approach to engaging guests on that topic, and I will cover this a little bit later on. In some cases, you will have no choice and you will have to prioritise eliminating products, particularly those that fall under the EU directive on single-use plastic. And this is where we advise businesses to try, where possible, to be sure that the plan isn't just about replacement. Now, it's quite a concern to us when we hear that businesses will simply just replace single-use plastic with another single-use product. And whilst the legislation obviously allows you to do this, it's very much a linear mindset. And there are other contributors to the Turismo de Portugal project who have created some great tools on circularity, which we would highly recommend you use in conjunction with our tools when it comes to eliminating or reducing single-use plastic. But at the same time, we're realistic, and we know you can't just become a waste-free hotel overnight. But working towards achieving those circular economy principles is going to be really important if you don't want to be left behind. And it's hard. It's hard to change mindsets, but the earlier you start to do this, the easier it will be in the longer term. And then other hotels we work with, especially chain hotels, they take a top 20 approach. So they use the cost and consumption exercise that we talked about as part of the baseline to identify the most common items used in their hotel, and then they commit to eliminating or reducing those. Now, in your case, it doesn't have to be a top 20, it could be a top 5, or it could be a top 10. If you are operating as a hotel chain and you want to do this, it's a good idea to have someone coordinating this centrally so that any common products across all of the hotels or across a region can be identified. Often you might even find that you end up with more than 20 products because many things can be grouped together. But remember, if you want to start with one product and get that right, then that's a brilliant idea too. It's better to do something than nothing. And in terms of taking a cost-saving approach, plastic is a really cheap material. So we highly recommend seeing cost savings as a bonus rather than the end goal. The end goal, we would always advocate to be waste reduction. But that said, there can be significant cost savings on certain products. For example, filtering and bottling your own water on site can bring up to 80% in cost savings, and switching to refillable toiletries generally saves on costs too. The reason people think it's going to be expensive to eliminate plastic is because they usually think about the cost of the replacements. So if you're replacing single-use plastic amenities like a shoe shine or a nail file, cotton buds, shower caps, all those things from the guest rooms, if you replace those with alternatives from other materials, then it definitely will be more expensive. And it will also mean you're not actually reducing waste, you're just changing the type of waste that you create. And ultimately, our goal is about reduction and elimination more than replacement. Now, given the increased awareness of the impacts of plastic, we've seen a huge amount of alternatives come onto the market. And of course, you will need to replace some of those items sometimes. And it can be really confusing to understand all of the terminology. As part of the Turismo de Portugal toolkit, we've put together some simple explanations to help you understand what some of this terminology means. The important thing really is not to take any statements at face value, but to take the time to speak with suppliers of alternative products, whether they're reusable or single-use products, and ask about their environmental credentials. Speak to the waste collection companies that work with you and ask them to find out what materials are readily acceptable at the waste facilities, and find out what happens to the products when you've actually disposed of them. These types of conversations will help you to make more informed decisions when it comes to choosing alternatives. And there's not really much point in solving the problem of plastic reduction if the alternative product creates a whole new set of problems for you. And I'm sure those of you that are working on this already or that are planning to start are all aware that you're balancing wider sustainability considerations and not just waste. And of course, not all alternatives to plastic are as green as they seem. There can be hidden impacts, like how resources are grown or mined, how much energy and water is required to create alternative products, emissions associated with transport and the use of products. So it's not just about litter, but it can be difficult for you to find all of this information out. But where you can, very much think about more than just the disposal credentials of a product when you're making a purchasing decision. Of course, we don't expect businesses to be able to do all of this for every single product. But what we want to highlight here again is just to start asking yourselves the question, and don't just assume because something is made from paper or bamboo that it's automatically better than plastic. A good example, for instance, are different types of bags. So cotton, for instance, from a cotton bag, it's a natural product, but it requires a lot of water. And cotton fields are generally situated in areas of the world where water is scarce. Paper requires processes that are energy and water intensive to process it. Cotton might be dyed in different colours, using even more water and energy. And both of these are heavier than a plastic bag, so they carry higher transport emissions per bag. And the amount of uses is also really important. So according to a report by UNEP, a paper bag needs to be used between 4 and 8 times to have the same environmental impact as a plastic bag. And this increases dramatically to 130 if you use cotton bags. So it's really about thinking about those materials and planning what would those items actually be used for. A cotton bag is obviously much less likely to become litter. Paper bags won't cause environmental damage necessarily if they end up in environments, whereas plastic bags are very harmful to the environment from a pollution perspective. So it just gives you an idea of the different things to consider. So once you know more about the types of products you're consuming, how much they cost your business, what brand standards and other influences have a bearing on the purchase of plastics that you produce, that you purchase, you can start to plan for change. And not everybody likes change. Not everybody is enthusiastic about reducing single-use plastic, especially if it means adding to an already heavy workload. So rather than enforce the changes on staff without consulting them, we recommend involving staff in the decision-making process. And obviously, you can oblige them to make changes, but the results are much better, much quicker and longer lasting when staff do these changes because they want to and just not because they have to. So the three key steps that we find work to engaging staff are to understand what the changes mean to them in practice. So how do those changes impact on their current roles? Giving staff the necessary information so that they have the ability to implement those changes properly, and also creating a willingness amongst staff to participate. You can't really take these steps in isolation. They're quite intrinsically linked together. And your staff, like most of us, I would imagine, are motivated to change when there is a benefit to them. So if changes help to save time and they're easy to implement, they're much more likely to be accepted. It's the same with ability. If people don't understand their role or they're not given the tools they need to make the change, then their motivation is really low. So if you think about the purchasing staff as an example, if they are really confused by all of the marketing terminology that we talked about earlier, they don't feel confident in making decisions related to alternatives and they lose motivation. And that's when people end up staying with what they know. And this is where it gets hard to break those habits. It's really important that staff feel confident about changes, otherwise they won't buy into them. The changes won't be part of your DNA, which is part of the key success strategy, and the guests won't understand why those changes have been made. So essentially, it all comes down to whether you really mean this or not. And if not, then the strategies won't be as successful as perhaps you would like them to be. A good way that we've seen over the course of the years to get staff involved is to hold a staff workshop. This is a picture from the last in-person workshop that we were able to hold in 2019. This was in Turkey at one of the TUI Magic Life hotels. And staff from a number of different hotels in the region were invited to take part. And we've held these workshops for many times now, and I know the first thing anybody wants to tell me is why they can't do something. Everybody wants to tell me what won't work, and it's really important that I let people get this out of their system. So whenever we hold workshops and webinars now online for staff, this is what we do. We get the staff to sit together, or we put them into breakout rooms in a webinar, and we give them 10 or 15 minutes to discuss and write down all the problems, everything they think they can't do. And one person would feed back to the group and tell us about that. And we encourage them to be very honest at this point. And we generally find one or two are happy to question things like brand standards and management procedures. And then we go back and we ask them to look at their list of problems and to discuss all the potential solutions together. What could they do to overcome the problems they identified? What needs to happen? What needs to change? Who needs to lead that change? How can other people support it? And we encourage people to think differently. And when we've done this before, it's usually people from other departments that come up with new suggestions. So for example, in a hotel in Gran Canaria, where I live and work, the management team wanted to remove plastic bottles of water from guest rooms and replace those with glass. Now, it was usually the housekeeping team that replaced the plastic bottles. And when they tried to put the glass bottles onto the trolleys just weren't equipped for the weight. They couldn't carry the weight of these glass bottles, and it caused a lot of problems. And in the end, they went back to plastic bottles, but the guests weren't happy about this. So during a workshop, when we talked about it, it was actually the food and beverage manager that suggested his team could change the bottles when his staff went around the minibar. So literally, just by bringing people together from different departments, it helped us find a solution that we might not have found in isolation had we just only spoken about it with the housekeeping team. Now, of course, all of this relies on management teams to lead by example and to do this by always being solutions focused. And I find that turning the arguments that you see on the left-hand side of the table there into the opportunities that you can see on the right-hand side, they work really well to get people into a solutions-based mindset. And it's also probably fair to say that there will be a core number of people in your organisation that are willing to take the lead. Many hotels these days have sustainability champions or a green team. And if you have this already, these can be great people to lead your plastic and waste reduction programme. If you don't, you could think about who makes a good plastic champion. You might already have an idea of somebody in mind, someone that always comes to work with a reusable bag, somebody that talks about the problem and wishes they could do something about it. These sorts of people are amazing ambassadors for change, and they're often so enthusiastic that they take others with them on this journey. They overcome so many obstacles because they're naturally solutions focused. And in the end, behaviour breeds behaviour, and you start to create a new culture around plastic reduction. You start to create your DNA, you start to create your success strategy. But it's important as well to remember that even champions can become deflated, and this is usually because once the initial excitement wears off, they're left doing all of the work without recognition. And the importance of recognition, of saying thank you to someone in front of everyone else in a staff meeting, for instance, that shouldn't be underestimated. We all want to feel good and feel valued. These are some of the photographs from my time at Thomas Cook a while back now, when I looked after sustainability in destinations. And one thing I made a point of was recognising and celebrating both effort and achievement. And just putting people's photograph on a notice board, or taking the time to talk to them, to speak to them about what they're doing, is an amazing form of recognition. The last picture that's just about to come up on the screen there was actually taken in the Algarve. Some of the team wanted to switch their car for electric bikes, and they set off a bit of a trend, and the other reps did it as well. And it's just really exciting to see that there are people that can drive this change and this positive motivation. And when it comes to engaging guests, it's actually quite a similar scenario, in that there needs to be a benefit for the guest as well. And we have to be realistic and acknowledge that most people's primary motivation to travel on holiday is to relax and unwind, get to know new places, enjoy new experiences. But it's also true to say that more people feel better doing this if they know that sustainability impacts are covered, that they're taken into consideration by the holiday companies they choose to travel with and the accommodations where they choose to stay. The challenge for a business, therefore, is to do this with the least amount of inconvenience for guests. That means taking all of the steps to make the more sustainable option the easiest, the most convenient, and the most attractive option. And if some inconvenience is expected, then to position that change in a way that makes it clear that the benefits outweigh the inconvenience. And it's actually quite amazing to see how quickly changes are accepted by guests when the benefits are explained clearly. Now, as with earlier, we speak with a lot of hotels, and we also see patterns amongst those that are successful at getting guests on board with changes. And more often than not, these 4 simple strategies will work for everybody, although obviously the type and style of communications will depend on your guest demographic. But following these 4 steps is a really good way to engage your guests. So If we look at these in a bit more detail, keeping it simple and easy, Marriott has really quite a good example related to bathroom amenities. They still want to provide the service in case any guests forget essential items. Some of the services are free of charge, others are charged to the room, but the guests make a simple request from an app on their phone. The process is easy, it's well communicated during check-in, the guests know what to do, and it causes them no inconvenience. I don't have any statistics as to what they achieve through this, but I know we've done a similar thing with other hotels, not with an app, but just guest information. It does significantly reduce waste and costs. We also find that people are more likely to support changes when they know why you're asking them to do something. So rather than having a simple strapline like help us to keep our beaches clean, you can tell people why you want to do that. So it could be refilling your usable bottles helps us to keep plastic bottles from polluting the environment where we live and the beautiful beaches that you've travelled here to enjoy. We've seen from TripAdvisor comments that we saw earlier, this is important to people. They can experience this benefit immediately themselves if they follow the instructions that you're asking them to. And to stay positive and focus on benefits and achievements, people feel good to be part of something positive. So this is a particularly useful approach if the changes require effort on the part of the guest. So imagine if there was a sign on the water dispenser that said, 85% of our guests enjoy safe, great tasting drinking water from our refill dispensers, and last year helped us to eliminate 100,000 plastic bottles. We'd love you to be part of that achievement. You'd be like, wow, yes, I want to be part of that achievement. I want to make that effort. I'm going to make that effort to do that. And we'll talk about communications touch points in a second, but I wanted to highlight this picture I took myself at a hotel in Amsterdam, nothing to do with plastic necessarily here, but their communications strategy to guests is probably the best that I've seen. And there aren't many places I know that would see a clothes hanger as an opportunity to communicate. Their strapline is eco-sexy. That obviously won't work for anybody. It worked for me, though, to be honest, I loved it. But making people feel good about your brand like this is an amazing way to engage guests and create loyalty. The words on the hanger, could just as easily say made from recycled wood or no plastic covers in our dry cleaning. They're not quite as sexy, but you get the point. And there's so many other communications touch points. These are the most obvious that are there on the screen. So when you're clear about your own vision, you can start to think about all these different opportunities to reach current and potential customers. And as part of the toolkit, the communications guide, which goes into all of the details around here and much more, will be made available to you in Portuguese. And this is also, don't discount the importance of feedback opportunities on review sites. This is an ideal example of a missed opportunity by a hotel in Cyprus. So this was the review that was left, and the reply contains no acknowledgement about the customer concerns about plastic. Wouldn't it be amazing if the hotel manager had responded with something like, thank you for your comments. We're working really hard towards reducing plastic in our hotels and would appreciate your feedback on the types of alternatives we could implement. How likely is the hotel to book, is the guest, I should say, to rebook that hotel after that response? There are so many communications opportunities, and as I said, we make those clearer in the guide. And so moving on, you know your baseline, you know the approach that you've decided to take, you've trained your staff, you've created customer communications in lots of exciting places, and customer-facing staff feel confident. So it's time now to implement those changes in real life, and it should be quite straightforward. However, we all know that, like anything, we never really know how something will work out until we try it, we implement the change, and we give it some time to settle in. So we highly recommend trialing a number of different alternative services or products and taking the time to get feedback from guests and staff before you make any final changes to processes, before you make any major purchasing decisions. And changes can take time, so don't be put off at the first hurdle. Think about what your complaint ratio threshold will be. Most places that I've worked with in the past don't make changes unless a significant percentage of guests complain. So if you get one complaint out of 100 guests, don't fixate on that. Make a note of it. Have a means for staff to capture complaints so that you can monitor over time. Find out exactly what the complaint is about. Is it the product? Is it the process that the guest needs to go through? Or is it just because they don't understand it? Perhaps it's just a change in the communications. So rather than making those assumptions, find out exactly. Otherwise, you'll always be fighting a losing battle. And if possible, measure the consumption or cost and the changes that you're making on a monthly or quarterly basis, because that's a great way to know if the changes that you're making are achieving a positive impact in real time. If you only look at statistics annually, then it could take you 12 months to realize something you thought was working actually isn't. So for example, if you implemented a straw reduction policy, but you see no reduction in consumption, then you know something is going wrong. Maybe straws were removed from the bar counter at the beginning of the season, but the staff have put them back. This actually happens quite a lot. Evaluate those guest experiences. Which types of reactions are guests having? If so, if they're good, what are you doing right? Find this out so you can apply that same logic to other changes. And are the changes efficient for staff, or are they causing a lot of other work? And finally, on reporting, to be very transparent, particularly when reporting statistics and impacts. And this might sound a little bit harsh, but it helps you to avoid accusations of greenwash. So if you lead with a hotel that says, I don't know, such and such hotel eliminates single-use plastic, when actually, unless you've, eliminated everything, we see this heading quite a lot, only to find that the hotel has only eliminated straws. So it's really important to be clear and transparent. And if you're doing things step by step, then position those changes within a timeline, because most people are happy to support if they know that you're on a journey. They understand that you've all got to start somewhere. So at the end of this month, the full Vamos reduzir os plásticos de uso único, I hope I said that with a good Portuguese accent, will be launched, containing all of the documents that you can see listed on the screen, thanks to the ongoing support of Turismo de Portugal in adapting and translating these for use in Portugal. This is where you will find all of the details about alternatives, the pros and the cons, the health and safety considerations, how to involve guests and more. And of course, we have the health and safety specific webinar tomorrow with Rachel. And on that, I will say thank you very much for your attention and hand back to Teresa. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Jo, for your presentation. So it's just 6 steps. It seems quite easy. No, I'm joking. But it's important that you reinforce that it can be a progressive work. I mean, you can start with the top 5 and then grow to a top 10 products to reduce or to eliminate. And by your experience in all over the world, so this is things happen. I mean, step by step. So this strategy that goes with small steps, which means that anyone can start doing something.
Yeah, I think so. And it's important to to not compare yourself to others or to these big headlines about those that are going plastic free. If you want to do that, that's great. But if you can only do one thing at the moment, do that and do it well, and give that one change time to embed, because there's nothing that's more motivating than doing something and it works. So it's much better to go slowly, get really excited about that change, and then take the next step, and then take the next step. Because if you try to do too much at once, it can be overwhelming. If you look at your purchasing list of single-use plastic, there could be 400 lines of product on it. And it's just, oh, where do I start? And so that's when the kind of A, B, C, D comes in, either by consumption, by cost, or because it's going to be mandated. That's where to choose your fight, if you like. And if you choose one product, brilliant. That's fantastic. Choose that and start.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, and don't forget to communicate that with your clients, with your customers. Joe, you talk about alternatives. So in the last webinar, we also talk a little bit about alternatives. Perhaps that is the most challenging issue of all this process, because sometimes plastic will still be the better alternative, or and perhaps there is still not enough information or suppliers to give the right alternative. So do you think this is a big challenge, and perhaps it will be easier in the future, but it's important to research information, to really study a little bit the alternatives?
Yes, definitely. And I think where absolutely possible, the best alternative is no alternative product. And that can be easier for some products than others. And it's really where we encourage people to look at those habits and look at what can be taken out completely, rather than just going straight to, here is the plastic product, what do we replace it with? So to try and avoid that where possible, and look at the services around that. So for instance, for lots of plastic items in the minibar, they could just be made available on request. The same with some of the miniature toiletries where that's possible, depending on the star rating. But to really think about how you're going to reduce and eliminate waste, not just plastic, because there's really no point, as I said in one of the slides, that we solve one problem and create another. And it's not easy to do. It does require a lot of time in staff engagement and in customer communications. But if we start now, it will be much easier to do that. And I think there are many alternatives, and that's because they are produced by private companies most of the time. And very often the waste infrastructure, which is usually under the management of the public sector, it can't keep up. It doesn't go as quickly as private businesses. So a lot of the alternative products at the moment, there's no waste infrastructure for them. And it's really important that we're not saying, for instance, that compostable plastic is bad. We're just saying that there are two types of compostable plastic. There are home compostable and there are industrially compostable plastics. And whichever you choose, you should really base that decision on what the waste infrastructure is able to support. And so it's really important to take that into consideration. And it's a concern to us that we see about 65% of hotels just want to go straight to replacement without thinking about the impact of that. So that's where we spend most of our time, helping people to look at new processes and new procedures and overcome habits and that's that's really interesting. It's really hard to do, but hopefully through the guidance documents that will be made available at the end of the month, the detail that we've got in those documents will help people to work through that process.
And that's why it's also so important to talk with municipalities which have in Portugal, or some enterprises, the companies or municipalities that work on waste, to see how can be the different kinds of wastes can be recycled or can be proceeded. So we have to talk with our suppliers, we have to talk with municipalities or entities in charge with the waste, and with the clients. And also this important thing that you have mentioned about the staff. So how to involve and motivate the staff. So this is also a process. It is easier when you have young staff, or it doesn't matter. The question is how to make them involved in the process.
Yeah, we find age, it can have some bearing on it, not necessarily because for older hotel managers that they don't believe in it or they don't want to change, but the habits are harder to break because they've had those habits for longer. So it's the motivation could be there, but putting the motivation into practice is sometimes more difficult. But again, it's different strategies work in different destinations, and if you need to connect your staff with why it would be important to them. So some of them will have their own reason. Some of them may want to have a better environment for their children to grow up in. Some of them might really be concerned about the impact on tourism and therefore the impact on their job. Some of them might not actually care about plastic, but they really want to be with a group of people, and they want like beach cleans, for instance. They want the social networking that comes from being together with nice people. So it's kind of finding out who is motivated by what, and then working within the dynamics of that team so that it works for you, for your destination, and for them. So I couldn't give you a strategy to say, do exactly this. That's why we just kind of give the headlines today. And then the work has to take place within the accommodation itself to understand the different motivations. And that's why we ask in the workshops we do, is reducing plastic important to you and why? And we get people to share that at the beginning. And then that gives us an insight into what's important to people. And that's where you can start to build from a really good foundation.
Yes. From our kit, just to finish, so we will have the guide with all the explanations and the good practices. We have a guide for communication, because as you mentioned, it's very important to communicate the right messages to your clients. And we have a checklist. Why is so important to monitor all the process? And this checklist that we will make available, it's not too complicated to do that?
Not really, no. Well, I don't think so, but that's probably because I made it, so it seems easy to me. But what we really tried to do was just create a simple Excel sheet. So it's, if you are in a hotel, most of you probably have done an audit, whether it's health and safety or quality or something. It's very similar to that, but it takes you through each of the operational areas, and we've listed every type of single-use plastic that we think you could possibly come across. And it's a nice way to do it is to actually split it into operational area and give maybe the housekeeping team their checklist, and they can go off and they can find what types of single-use plastic are being used. And it's a good way to engage people. also a good way for people to go, oh, we never realized we had so much plastic, and start that motivation. So it's really just a list to help you get started in creating that baseline, and then map that list to your purchasing spreadsheet so that you can see the cost, and then start to think about why do we keep that? Is it a brand standard we've just got used to for ages? Do we think guests would complain? So we need to maybe change that and see if they do complain. So it's just there to help you, so you're not starting from scratch. It's, you know, it's something just to give you that start if you've not already done so.
And also our guide will also have a lot of good practices and examples, and because it is in a digital version, we can put news if we if along this this path that we will have in Portugal with our partners, our companies, if we become to have more good examples, we can add on our guide, and we will have much more examples than there will be now in the guide.
Yes, that would be great.
Yes,
that would be really great.
Okay, so we have no more questions. So I think people are very interested in seeing the guide and use it. Thank you, Joe, so much for your work with us and your awareness around the world. So also working to make tourism a force for good. That's our main focus. A todos os que estiveram neste webinar, o nosso agradecimento. Mantivemos o horário como estava previsto, uma hora. Como dissemos, até ao final do mês ficará disponível este kit com estas várias ferramentas para ajudar as empresas, o alojamento turístico a implementar de uma forma mais fácil estas medidas. Depois faremos a devida divulgação para também se aperceberem que os guias vão estar disponíveis, e manteremos aqui o contacto com a Travel Without Plastic para algumas questões, alguns esclarecimentos que aconteçam depois da divulgação do guia. Vamos reduzir o plástico de uso único no alojamento turístico. Muito obrigado a todos. Lembro que amanhã temos uma versão um pouco mais especializada. Joe, before we finish the session, can you just highlight the main contents of the webinar for tomorrow, so people can? It's not the same, so we will focus on specific contents.
Yes, so tomorrow we are focusing more on how to reduce single-use plastic and still meet hygiene and safety expectations. So my colleague Rachel will be leading that. Predominantly there is an accommodations focus, but it will be equally relevant. The topics that we cover will be useful to anybody, to be honest with you. So we really look at, is single-use plastic really safer? And we take away some of those myths, because in some cases it isn't. So we'll share our experience of that. And we'll also share some of the operating procedures to help hotels and participants understand how they can make those changes through, very often again, good communications rather than plastic products. So we'll be looking at what processes to put in place instead of what single-use plastic products to buy.
Okay, so it will be very interesting and useful also. Muito obrigado a todos, então, até amanhã, desejamos nós, ou quem não puder estar connosco amanhã, até breve. Fiquem bem. Um abraço. Thank you, Joe and Rachel.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.